You know that feeling when you're running a marathon and you finally see the finish line way off in the
Oh,
distance?
yeah. Or maybe building something big like a ship, and you can just picture it sailing away.
Exactly. There's this deep human need, I think, to visualize the end of a really challenging task. It keeps you going.
Absolutely. It gives you focus, right?
Yeah.
Sustains your energy, gives you that sense of direction when things inevitably get tough. Without it, it's easy to just drift or, well, stop.
Right. So let's apply that to something really challenging, like planting new churches, especially in places where it's, difficult or maybe the gospel hasn't really taken root before. What does that finish line look like? What's the moment you can kind of step back and say, okay, mission accomplished, at least for this initial phase?
Well, that's exactly the question. Really insightful text we've been looking at tackles head on. And this deep dive is all about unpacking what that source material says is the crucial, the final step in this specific kind of church planting work.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack it. What is this pivotal final step, according to the source?
So the material is actually pretty clear. It points to what it sees as a really consistent pattern in the New Testament. It argues that the true ending point for this first phase of apostolic church planting, the moment the planters could feel their main job was done, was the appointment of the first group of local elders.
Ah, okay. So not just seeing people believe or even getting a group meeting together regularly, but establishing actual local indigenous leadership.
Precisely. And it holds up Acts 14, verses 21 to 23 as kind of the prime example. You have Paul and Barnabas, right? After preaching and making disciples, they swing back through the cities they'd just been in. And what do they do before heading off? They strengthen the disciples, encourage them, and crucially, the text says they appointed elders for them in every church.
Huh. In every church. And notice it says elders, plural, but in every church, singular. That feels significant.
It does. The source really leans into that exact point. It highlights how the word elders is plural, while church is singular in that context. It sees this as a consistent biblical pattern. Right. Every single church had multiple elders appointed by the apostles or their delegates. In fact, it makes a statistical point. Out of 19 times elder is used for churches in the New Testament, 13 specifically use the plural form in relation to a single church. It was about setting up local folks to shepherd long term.
Okay, so this specific step, appointing those first local elders, is framed as the finish line for that initial planting work. Why does the source see it as being just so pivotal?
Well, it uses some strong language. It calls it a watershed moment, a pivotal event that can genuinely change the trajectory for a whole country or people group. It suggests it's not just, organizational tidiness, but it represents the gospel gaining what it calls an irreversible foothold.
Irreversible foothold, I like that, like the analogy the source uses, right, about a seed becoming a whole field.
Exactly that. And the material draws a pretty stark contrast based on, observation and experience in the field. It says, look, by far, most new fellowships that don't manage to appoint a plurality of elders, they eventually just fall apart. Yeah. But conversely, the vast majority that do get elders established, they don't just survive. They tend to grow and even start planting other churches themselves.
Oh, wow. That's a huge difference in survival rates. It really does underscore how important this step must be.
It really does. And the source shares this powerful example from Central Asia. They describe the day they finally trained and appointed the first local elders as a truly historic day for that people group. And guess what happened next? That brand new church, now led by its own elders, went on to commission its own first church planters to go even further out. The seed really had become a field.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. You mentioned structure, leadership. Some people might argue that, the way leadership is structured isn't nearly as important as just having, say, vibrant faith or good Bible teaching.
Yeah. And the source pushes back on that quite strongly.
It seems like it does.
It warns against thinking like that, arguing that these structural things, including how leaders are chosen and how they relate to their church body, are actually crucial when the storms come. And those storms can come from inside the church or, from outside opposition. Experience apparently bears this out pretty clearly.
And what about the idea that the New Testament just doesn't say that much about church leadership or governance? You hear that sometimes.
The source tackles that directly, too. It says, actually, there's quite a bit of material in the New Testament on the subject. It also tries to navigate between two kind of extreme views on how leadership should form. One says planters shouldn't form anything structure-wise, just leave it all to the new believers.
Which the source doesn't see as biblical.
Right. And the other extreme says the Bible dictates church polity, the specific governance structure, right down to the bylaws.
So it's finding a middle ground, not a rigid one-size-fits-all blueprint, but definitely not a free-for-all either.
Exactly. The source suggests the Bible gives us broad principles or norms, but the actual forms, how elders function day to day, can and probably should vary greatly, depending on the cultural context.
Okay, speaking of those broad principles, you brought up the plurality point from Acts 14 earlier. Is that presented as one of these core non-negotiable principles according to the source?
Yes, very much so. It's presented as a fundamental biblical teaching. The source claims the New Testament evidence is pretty unmistakable that each local church should have a plurality of elders, more than one sharing the load.
And we see that in other places besides Acts 14, like Acts 20 or Titus 1.
Exactly. The source points to Paul calling for the elders, plural, of the church in Ephesus in Acts 20. Again, multiple elders, single church. And Titus being told to appoint elders, plural, in every city, singular city context in Titus 1.5. It sees a really consistent pattern there, multiple elders per church.
Okay, so if plurality is the pattern, why is having just one elder seen as, well, problematic or not good, as the source puts it?
It lays out a number of pretty compelling reasons. First, there's the risk of what it calls the Diotrephes syndrome, from 3 John 9.
The guy who loved to be first.
Right. The danger of a strong single leader becoming prideful or heavy-handed. Unchecked authority is risky.
Makes sense.
Second, one person just can't have all the gifts and perspectives needed to shepherd a whole church effectively. The source uses this nice analogy of a husband and wife, often having very different personalities, but together they see situations from all angles. A diverse elder board, even if they clash sometimes, brings that broader wisdom.
Yeah, you need those different viewpoints and complementary strengths.
Definitely. Third, one person often struggles to relate well to everyone in the church, different ages, different personalities. Fourth, the sheer workload described for elders in the New Testament. It's just too much for one person. It leads to burnout, discouragement, loneliness. It wasn't designed for one guy to carry it all.
And it sounds like there are external risks, too, not just internal ones.
For sure. A solo leader is a really vulnerable target for opposition, or just, the enemy. If that one leader is imprisoned or falls into sin, the whole flock can scatter. The source basically says, depending on one person's resistance is foolish.
That vulnerability seems especially acute in hostile places, right?
Absolutely. Plus, a single strong leader, even unintentionally, can end up stifling the growth of other potential leaders. It just doesn't create space for them. And if planters only appoint one elder, they might feel obligated to stick around longer to support that person, which can muddy the waters about roles and actually delay appointing more elders.
Okay, one last point on that.
Yeah, a single leader can easily become a bottleneck, just limiting what the church can do and how much it can grow.
Wow, that's a really strong case for plurality. But you touched on cultural challenges earlier. What about places that really favor a single, strong leader model, like parts of the Arab world or Asia? How does the source handle that tension?
It acknowledges that, yes, this is often a tough countercultural idea in many contexts, but then it makes a really crucial distinction. Having a plurality of elders doesn't automatically mean having an equality of elders in terms of, say, influence or giftedness.
Okay, unpack that a little. How does that work?
Well, it points to 1 Timothy 5.17-18. That passage talks about elders who rule well, deserving double honor, especially those who really labor in preaching and teaching. This suggests, that there can be different levels of respect or maybe influence among the elders based on their specific gifts and how hard they work. It also brings up James in the Jerusalem church. He was clearly a prominent figure among the elders there, even with apostles around. Kind of a first among equals, perhaps.
So it's possible for one elder to be more prominent, maybe even lead the elder team, but there should still be others alongside him sharing the overall responsibility and authority.
That's the picture it paints. The source argues that even a very prominent leader, all the more, needs other leaders elders around him for wisdom, for accountability, for sharing the burden. Now, how that team of elders makes decisions, whether it's like one man, one vote, or by consensus, or some other way that seems to be left more open, the source suggests that's where culture can shape the form, as long as the principle of plurality is maintained. It doesn't see a rigid biblical command for the decision-making process itself.
The source also quickly mentions its view on women as elders, acknowledging other views exist.
Yes, it states the author's view that the role is for men, but respects that not everyone reads the text the same way on that point.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit into the really practical side of things. We're talking about pioneer settings, right? unreached places, often hostile, appointing elders from potentially brand new believers in those contexts. That must have some unique hurdles.
Oh, absolutely. And the source highlights several key practical issues that come up again and again. First, there's the whole question of maturity. You've got those lists of characteristics in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. The source argues these should be seen as qualities or traits that are relative. They're not like a rigid qualifications checklist where you have to score 100% before you can even be considered.
Right. So it's not about finding perfectly polished, seminary-trained leaders right out of the gate.
Exactly. The material points out that the New Testament churches appointed elders who were mature enough, even if they were still relatively new in their faith. And it argues that plurality helps here, too. You get a collective maturity, where different men cover each other's weak spots. If you wait for perfect candidates, you might wait forever, and the window of opportunity could close.
What about the timing, though? Appointing too early seems risky. Paul warns about new converts getting puffed up, right? And about not being hasty. But you also said waiting too long is often the bigger problem.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. Those warnings in 1 Timothy about pride in a new convert, 1 Tim 3.6, or being hasty in laying on hands, 1 Tim 5.22, are real and need wisdom. But the source quotes a veteran planter, Dick Scoggins, who apparently said that based on decades of experience, when mistakes are made in timing, it's usually waiting too long. Scoggins supposedly calls 1 Timothy 5.22 not a stop sign, urging practical judgment rather than letting excessive caution paralyze things.
And you mentioned we should expect things not to go smoothly when trying to establish this local leadership.
Yeah, the source is very upfront about this.
Yeah.
Appointing the first elders is like taking significant ground back from the enemy.
Yeah.
You shouldn't expect them to just roll over and applaud. It shares some really tough, real-life examples from the field just to illustrate the potential cost and the kinds of challenges that can arise.
Like that story from Kurdistan.
Yes, a really hard situation. A key potential elder, Mahmoud, was actually shot and killed right before they were planning to appoint elders. It tragically set the process back for years. Another example from the Middle East involved a huge fight between the wives of two main elder candidates. It completely fractured the fellowship and put elder appointments on hold indefinitely. And just a gut-wrenching story from Southeast Asia where, literally on the day they were supposed to be appointed, one candidate's wife confessed that he'd physically abused her that very morning. Obviously, everything stopped right there.
Wow. Those are incredibly difficult, heartbreaking stories. It really drives home what the source means about expecting spiritual warfare and just plain difficulty in this kind of work.
They are tough.
Yeah.
But the source frames them with this perspective. God has always worked through extraordinarily deficient church planters and imperfect local believers. It's messy. It's real life. As the source puts it, we are all damaged goods that God is in the process of healing.
Okay, let's touch on some other structural questions the source addresses for these pioneer contexts. What about starting with just 2 elders? Is that okay?
The source says, ideally, 3 is better. More stability, more diverse gifts. But it acknowledges that 2 can work, especially if developing a 3rd elder is a clear goal right from the start. It does warn about the vulnerability, though. If one of the 2 leaves or falls away, you're suddenly back to a single leader situation. It cites a case in Central Asia where a planter had to step back in temporarily because one of the 2 appointed elders moved away.
What about the expatriate planters themselves? Should they become elders in the new church they started?
The source personally advises against it. It draws a distinction between the biblical roles. The apostle or planter is seen as temporary, catalytic, moving onto new ground. The elder is local, permanent, shepherding that specific flock. Mixing those roles, it argues, can confuse things and potentially delay the church becoming truly indigenous and self-governing.
And similarly, what about local believers who are gifted church planters? Should they also serve as elders in one specific church long term?
Again, the source discourages this as a long-term arrangement. It sees shepherding one existing church and planting new churches as very distinct roles needing different focuses and callings. It suggests people need to discern their primary long-term calling.
Okay, how about this sequence? Appointing deacons before you appoint elders. Is that a good stepping stone?
The source calls this a valid approach that can work. It notes the qualifications for deacons in 1 Timothy 3 are pretty similar to elders in terms of character, and also that women can serve as deacons.
Yeah.
However, the source personally advises against doing it this way.
Oh, interesting. Why not?
It gives 3 main reasons. First, it points out that the New Testament church plants seem to have gone straight to appointing elders as the primary spiritual leaders. Second, it worries that starting with deacons might make deaconship seem like just a temporary training ground for eldership, potentially devaluing the distinct role of deacons. And third, it thinks this approach might just prolong the new church's dependence on the outside planters for the main spiritual leadership and direction.
Got it. And the practical question of paying elders, does the source weigh in on that?
It does. Going back to 1 Timothy 5.17818, the source says it's biblically fine for some elders to receive financial support for their work, especially those who are leading well and really putting in the effort with preaching and teaching. It suggests this would likely be just one or two on an elder team, not usually everyone. Crucially, though, it states that the money for this should come from the local church itself. It doesn't see a biblical basis for ongoing outside funding paying local church elders.
And just quickly, how elders make decisions together. Did you say the source sees flexibility there?
Yet, not a rigid formula dictated by Scripture, according to this source.
Mm.
It emphasizes elders should seek God together, discuss things respectfully, avoid personal agendas, and consulting the congregation on big decisions has precedent, like in Acts 6. But the actual process within the elder team, how they hash things out, the source suggests there's lots of room for cultural factors there. An elder team in rural Africa might operate differently than one in downtown Chicago or Tibet, reflecting their cultural norms for group decision-making.
Okay, this is super helpful. So we've defined the finish line, appointing local elders. We understand why it's so pivotal. We've tackled some potential objections and faulty thinking. We've looked hard at the non-negotiable of plurality and talked through the real-world practical challenges, especially in pioneer settings. So the big question is, how do you actually get there? Especially in these tough, sometimes hostile environments with brand new believers, what are the practical steps the source recommends?
Right. The material wraps up by offering 5 key practical recommendations for intentionally moving towards appointing that vital first group of Indigenous elders.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's number 1?
First, teach the whole fellowship consistently over time. Teach them New Testament ideas about what the local church is, how it's supposed to function, all those one another passages, love one another, serve one another, admonish one another, and teach specifically about the vital role elders play as shepherds. And this is important. Teach openly about how the planter's own role is going to change and shrink as local leaders step up. Prepare them for your eventual departure.
Okay, teach the whole body. What's next?
Second, start strategically pulling back from being the main teacher or the primary decision maker for the group. This does 2 things. It weans the group off, depending on the planter, and it frees up the planter's time and energy to really focus on mentoring potential elders and leaders more intensely. This is where you look for those FAT men, faithful, available, teachable drawing on Timothy 2.2.
FAT leaders. Good acronym.
Yeah, and this mentoring involves deep work on their character, their family life, their attitudes, plus giving them real ministry responsibilities so they learn by doing.
Makes sense. Number 3.
Third, when you sense things are moving in the right direction, establish the role of elder candidate and talk about it openly with the whole fellowship. This means actually challenging potential leaders to pray about stepping into this role. It makes the whole process clear, intentional. It defines the commitment involved. It creates a specific period, maybe 2 to 6 months, the source suggests, for focused training and also for intense character work.
Like dealing with those tricky issues you mentioned earlier, maybe like Mahmoud's business dealings.
Exactly. Using that candidate period to really address any lingering character concerns head on. It also prepares the rest of the church to accept these specific individuals as leaders and gives the church a chance to provide feedback. And having multiple candidates helps avoid that single leader bottleneck we talked about earlier.
Good point. Okay, number 4.
Fourth, use that elder preparation time as a really rich teaching opportunity. Focus on subjects crucial for leadership: character, handling suffering, the nuts and bolts of shepherding, biblical church leadership itself. Often, this focused period leads to huge spiritual growth for the candidates. The source suggests maybe bringing in other gifted teachers if possible, or using solid resources translated into the local language. It mentions John Piper's book, Biblical Eldership, being used effectively in Central Asia, for instance.
Okay, and the final recommendation.
Finally, and this is critical especially in dangerous places, talk candidly and realistically about suffering and persecution. Don't shy away from it. Point to passages like Acts 14.22. Through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. The source really stresses equipping believers biblically and spiritually for the hardships that likely lie ahead. Without being timid about it, even if you, as an outsider, might personally face less risk than the local believers will.
Wow, that's a really solid, intentional pathway. It doesn't ignore the difficulties, but it lays out clear steps.
Yeah, it's about process, deep discipleship, and ultimately trusting God to work through flawed people in really challenging circumstances.
So, when a church plan does reach that day, when that first group of Indigenous elders is finally appointed, the source says it might not make the news, but it's still a historic event, a truly pivotal moment.
Absolutely. It's described as this incredibly precious milestone for the kingdom of God, a step that really echoes in eternity. It's the visible sign that the scene we talked about is becoming a field.
And it loops right back to where we started, doesn't it? That human need to see the finish line. For that initial apostolic phase of church planting, establishing that first core group of local Indigenous elders, that really is the finish line.
It signifies that the church is putting down roots, it's gaining stability, it has the God-ordained leadership structure in place to hopefully stand on its own, to grow, and maybe even reproduce long after the people who started it have moved on.
So, thinking about everything we've unpacked, the challenges, the biblical patterns, the source highlights, the profound weight it gives this step. What does reaching this particular point, the successful establishment of Indigenous leadership, what does that mean for how you, the listener, think about the strength and the future of new church movements, especially in the hardest parts of the world? How might it challenge or maybe even redefine what success really looks like in this kind of long-term kingdom-focused work?